All right, if you have your Bible with you, I invite you to join me back to 1 Corinthians, and today we're going to be moving into chapter 8. 1 Corinthians chapter 8. As I made plain to you last Sunday morning, we are now done with our subject of marriage, divorce, and remarriage from chapter 7. I appreciate your patience as we waded through kind of that delicate subject. That is a hard subject because it is such a personal subject, and the teaching of Scripture is pretty strict on that particular subject. But we balance that out by taking note of the fact that God bears with our struggles and our weaknesses, and I hope after spending 6 weeks or so studying that with you, you feel like you've got a better grip on what the Old Testament, what Jesus, what Paul teach on that particular subject and how it all harmonizes together. But we are moving on today, and I'm happy that we are moving on. As I indicated last week, we are moving on from a subject that's very controversial to us, and we're moving on to a subject that was very controversial for them. And you and I are not going to struggle with this too much. The subject here is about what to do with meat that has been sacrificed at a pagan temple. And my guess is you've probably not lost a whole lot of sleep about that particular subject as of late. Paul's actually going to take 3 chapters to handle this, and your first thought may be, oh my goodness, 3 chapters on the subjects of eating meat to idols? You may think that's a little bit of a lengthy treatment for that, but while it is true that the specific subject is not going to be all that relevant to you, it is true that the principle behind the subject remains very relevant. And the principle behind the subject is, how do Christians live with the liberty that they have been given? How do you balance your rights with your responsibilities to your fellow brothers and sisters? And more specifically, the question is, how do you go about making decisions about what you should or shouldn't do when the Bible doesn't address something specifically? In the city of Corinth in the first century, that issue just happened to be eating meat that was sacrificed at a pagan temple. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. But for us, I'm guessing that if we put our mind to it, we probably could think up of a number of matters that fall in the category of disputable, debatable matters and have to do with the subject of Christian freedom. So as I was thinking about this week, I tried to write down a handful of things that I might fall under the category of a disputable matter. Perhaps the first one that comes to mind in American culture is that of drinking alcohol. That is a particularly American hang-up. I'll just tell you that. Whenever Ollie and I went to England a few years ago and studied the summer school session at Oxford, we spent a number of evenings out with the Christians there, and it was not at all unusual for them, almost all of them, to drink beer with the evening meal. Whenever they served a big banquet for us at the end of our summer school session, they served wine with all of that. And they find it quite strange that we over across the pond have a real obsession with that sort of thing in the church. Just as some of us probably find it strange that they don't even think about it at all. Now, they realize there's the dangers of alcoholism and all that kind of stuff, but they say there's dangers in every kind of excess, and so they don't find that particularly persuasive in not doing it. Another issue that could be on the disputable matter is, how about gambling, right? Some Christians are particularly have a very strong opinion about that. I seem to have absorbed in my youth that the church was pretty much against gambling, but I've noticed over the last 20 years that has changed, as there has been a number of Indian-owned casinos pop up just across the state line in Oklahoma, and I can name a handful of Christians and then maybe even an elder or two who, not in this congregation, not that I'm raising any deal, but who often go and yeah, that's right. And so, Jay, you'll have to stop that. But on top of that, you have issues like entertainment choices. What are Christians going to watch? What are they not going to watch? How much violence is too much violence? How much sex is too much sex? We could raise questions about the kind of music you listen to. How about the difficult subject of abortion? I think almost all Christians would agree that abortion is wrong, but you probably have various opinions in Christian groups about whether or not you should be always forced to vote for the pro-life candidate in each case. I don't think even in this church we all agree on that. Or in churches of Christ, how about the big issue, right? Instrumental music. Some feel that's an essential issue, some do not. Some who have come later into our fellowship just think the whole thing is kind of absurd. So even though the specific issue that Paul is going to raise is not going to be one that you and I are all that worried about, the principle behind it is fairly relevant. How do Christians make use of their freedom when they come across things that are not specifically addressed in Scripture? And while Paul will teach about the issue of idolatry and about food from pagan temples, the more important lesson that we're going to learn here is how do we make decisions in this regard, both weighing our rights, but also our responsibility to the conscience of our fellow brother and sister. So before we get into that question, let's first try to get our mind around what would it be like to live in the ancient city of Corinth, because that is a very important thing to understand as we think about this passage. As I was working on this class this week, I was thinking about Olya, who spent most of her week in New Orleans this week. She had a bank conference that she had to go down there for some training and certification and that kind of stuff. And of course, if you are in New Orleans, you got to go travel around a little bit while you're there and go do some of the fun things, especially if you've never been there before, and she had never been there. Now, I've been to New Orleans several times. Some of you remember telling some stories about Dad and I when we would go down to New Orleans. We went back-to-back years, 92 and 93, as a part of our trip going to Alabama to the big June Jam country music concert that would be put on there every year. And we had some fun experiences, and it was a very eye-opening experience for this boy from the Ozarks who hadn't been much out of my stomping grounds until that particular time. New Orleans has a very unique culture. It's all its own. It's a Southern culture. It's a French culture. It is, to a large degree, an African-American culture, especially in the jazz music. And so you have all of that sort of melding together that creates this really interesting vibe. Olya said all week, she says, I feel like a cool cat as I'm down here. It's just kind of that as you take in all of that. And I think something similar could be said about the city of Corinth. Corinth was its own unique place, largely because of its geographical location, which is sort of why New Orleans is that way. Corinth was on this little strip of land. I wish I had PowerPoint this morning so I could show it to you, but it's on this little strip of land on the Isle of Greek there, and it's a few miles wide, and it's surrounded by the sea on both the northwest really, and the southeast. The Adriatic Sea is to the northwest. The Aegean Sea is to the southeast. It was a port city. People would often pull up boats on one of those seas. They would then unload all of the cargo and carry the cargo across that several miles on land and then reload the ship on the other side. And rather than sending the ship all the way down around the end of Greece, which would be a very long and dangerous route, they would actually pull the ship out of the water and roll it on rollers all the way across there. They always tried to build a canal, but they never could do it in the ancient world. There is one now with more modern technology. And so it's full of all kinds of people. You got sailors there, you got the labor workers, you've got tradespeople of all kinds. It's a very eclectic sort of place. And among the things that you would certainly find as you strolled through that ancient city would be a plethora of temples that are scattered everywhere. Some were downtown near the marketplace in the Agora. Is Mike in here this morning? No, he's not. He's been there, and so he could tell you a little bit about this. There were temples just outside of the city walls. There were temples down by the sea, like for Poseidon and for that sort of thing. You had temples that were scattered all up. There was a mountain that was up on just on the outside of the city, one little mountain. They call it the Agora Corinth. And you have temples that were scattered all up and down that mountain. And then up on the very top, there would be a big temple that overlooked them all, and that temple was the temple of Aphrodite, the goddess of love and passion and fertility. And that very much, Larry, have you been there? You been to Corinth? Yeah, so you know a little bit. Have you seen some of the ruins there of some of those temples that were there? And so you had all kinds of goddesses and gods and goddesses. Apollo would have a temple in Corinth. Aphrodite, as we just said, Asclepius, Poseidon, Dionysius, all those would have had temples there in Corinth. Now, pagan temples were not like churches like we know today. They were basically big buildings that housed a statue of whatever god they were dedicated to. They weren't meeting halls like churches are. And so most of the activity actually took place outside of the temple in the courtyard. That's where the altar would be located. And it's here where people would come and bring their animals to sacrifice to their gods. And their sacrifices were meant to appeal for blessings. They were meant to appease anger. They also thought, and we'll come back to this a little bit later, that it was a way of ridding food of evil spirits, because they thought evil spirits could attach themselves to food. And so when you sacrifice it on the altar, it gets rid of the evil spirits. It cleanses it, if you will. And so this kind of life is just ingrained in many Greek cities, but certainly in a city like Corinth. And just like today, if you drove into any good-sized American city, you could recognize it because there would be Walmart and McDonald's and the banks and churches all over the place and so that sort of thing. So also, if you went into any Greek Roman city like Corinth, you would find similar things: the marketplace, the stadiums, the amphitheaters, and then also these temples. And if you were near one, it probably smelled like a big barbecue. Okay, it probably would have been a very distinctive aroma. And for pagan people, these sacrifices were just part of everyday life. People would come and make their individual sacrifices. Every year they'd have these big festivals where they would spread out food from these places, and everybody participated. And so the question is, how do you then, as a newly converted Christian, live in this environment? That'd be a little tough, wouldn't it? Before their conversion, they would have freely participated in the things that everybody participated in. And it would have had certain resonances with them, just like for you, Halloween and Thanksgiving and Christmas have certain resonances with you. How do you live now when everything around you has changed? Well, that background will kind of inform our study of 1 Corinthians chapters 8 through 10. And there is a specific question that is being asked in this regard. How do Christians handle the eating of meat that has had some kind of form of participation in a pagan ritual? And I would assume it probably would not have been a debatable matter about whether or not the Christian should participate in the ritual itself. But what about eating meat that was a part of the ritual but was later sold in the marketplace? And I hope by giving you some of this background that it gives you a little insight into just how complicated a question that might have been for some of the early Christians. It appears that in Corinth you had people who had no qualms about eating that because they knew this is all just pagan ritual stuff and there's nothing behind it, so it's all just a hoax, so we can just ignore it and do whatever we want. On the other hand, you appear to have some Christians in Corinth for whom this really bothers their conscience. They want nothing to do with anything that has had any contact with a pagan temple or a pagan ritual, and they can't understand why any Christian would. They might not even be clear on the fact that these statues, these temples, that there aren't maybe some gods that really are involved behind them. So how do we work this out in the Christian community? Well, that's the issue that Paul is going to address over the course of the next 3 chapters. And once again, he's not really bringing up the subject on his own. He's responding to what they have written him about. And we're going to see Paul quote the letter as he works his way through this. So over the course of the next 3 chapters, Paul's going to give his guidance on this. In chapter 8, if you want to write this down, Paul is going to give the general principle, okay? Then after he gives the general principle in chapter 8, in chapter 9, verse 1 through chapter 10 and verse 13, Paul will give an example of the principle at work in his own life, although he's going to use a different situation, okay? But he's going to illustrate the principle. That's chapter 9 to chapter 10 and verse 13. And then finally, from chapter 10 and verse 14 down to actually chapter 11 and verse 1, Paul is then going to apply the principle that he's just told us about and illustrated. He's going to apply it to the question that is at hand, which is eating food sacrifice to idols. So today we're going to look at the first part of this. We're going to look at chapter 8, which will basically give us the principle, and then we'll be ready to move on with the rest. So with that question in mind, or with that thought in mind rather, let's read our passage for consideration today. If your own Bible's open there, if not, it's on the back of your handout. And let's just read all of chapter 8 together. It's not very long, really. Verse 1. Now about food sacrificed to idols. That's the subject. We know that, and he's going to quote here, we all possess knowledge. But, he responds, knowledge puffs up, while love builds up. Those who think they know something do not know as they ought to know. Do not yet know as they ought to know, he says. But whoever loves God is known by God. So then, about food sacrificed to idols, we know that, and he's going to quote again, an idol is nothing at all in this world, and that, and then he quotes again, there is no God but one. For even if there are so-called gods, whether in heaven or on earth, as indeed there are many gods and many lords, yet for us there is but one God, the Father from whom all things came and for whom we live, and there is but one Lord, Jesus Christ, through whom all things came and through whom we live. But not everyone possesses this knowledge. Some people are still so accustomed to idols that when they eat sacrificial food that they think of as having been sacrificed to a god, and since their conscience is weak, it is defiled. But food does not bring us any nearer to God, nor are we any worse if we do not eat, and nor are we any better if we do. So be careful that the exercise of your rights does not become a stumbling block to the weak. For if someone with a weak conscience sees you with all of your knowledge eating in an idol's temple, won't that person be emboldened to eat what is sacrificed to idols? So this weak brother or sister for whom Christ died is destroyed by your knowledge. When you sin against them in this way, you wound their weak conscience, you sin against Christ. Therefore, if what I eat causes my brother or sister to fall into sin, I will never eat meat again, so that I will not cause them to fall. Now, I don't know that I would say that, but that's what the Apostle Paul says, okay? I'm probably not going to become a vegetarian for you. I'm drawing the line right there, all right? So as we look at this passage here this morning, I want to do so under 3 different headings for those of you who like to use the handouts. Anybody also need one that hasn't got one? Everybody got one, or at least access to one that needs one? This passage is going to show us 3 Roman numerals. First, there's going to be a general principle about knowledge. Then we're going to spell out what the general content is of the Corinthians' knowledge. And then finally, we'll end class with a warning that not all people have this particular knowledge. Knowledge is obviously the key word with all of these headings, and so that's going to dominate our discussion here today, and I'll try to make sure we get through as much as we can. Let's first talk about the general principle about knowledge. You'll see the general principle stated in the middle of verse 1. Knowledge puffs up, while love builds up. Some translations say, knowledge makes arrogant, while love edifies. But before we reflect too much on that statement and the principle that comes from that statement, let me draw your attention to the phrase that in my Bible is accentuated in quotes. I don't know whether it is in yours or not. And that line is, from verse 1, we know that we all possess knowledge. How many have that in quotes in your Bible? So yeah, those of you who have the newer update in the NIV, and I think the ESV also, at least in the newer editions, has that as well. I think Paul quotes it here because most scholars have come to the conclusion that this phrase and the other 2 that will come in the next section, it comes out of the letter that they had written to Paul, and they are saying to Paul, we've got knowledge about this. And the implication is we think some of the others don't have knowledge, and this needs to be corrected. So what knowledge is it that they are claiming to have? They're claiming to have the knowledge that idols are not real, and that there are no real gods behind these statues that are found in these temples. Now, as we think about this, I want to remind you again about what some of the Corinthians felt about food, and especially about food that had been sacrificed at a temple. The Corinthians, like many ancient people, were a very superstitious people, like many modern people actually, very superstitious, right? They were superstitious about a lot of things, but one of the primary things that they were superstitious about was evil spirits. And they thought that evil spirits could gain control over a person's life and could influence the events in a person's life. And they thought that one of the ways that they could do that is by attaching themselves to certain objects which would gain them access to people. Food just happened to be one of those objects that they thought demons could attach to. And since food is something that goes inside of you, it was thought that's one of the ways that the evil spirits can have access to your inner being. So one of the ways that you get rid of these evil spirits off of this food is you take it to a priest at one of these temples, and they will do a ritual over it. And the priest would pronounce the right words over the evil spirits. It would shoo it away. The animal would be partially sacrificed on the altar, and then the animal would be divvied up. Part of it was burned on the altar as a sacrifice, the fat and the bones. Part of it was given to the priest as his share, particularly the thigh, I think, was usually given to the priest. We're talking about Greek ritual, not Old Testament Israelite rituals, okay? And then the largest part of the animal went to the family, and they were able to share it as a feast with whoever they brought along with them, or if they wanted to take it home later to have a big festival at their house. Well, the priest does this day after day for multiple people all day long, and guess what? They gather up more thighs than they can eat in any particular period of time. So what do? In order to support their work there at the temple, they take the extra meat, they sell it to the market. And the market, this meat that goes to market, is very valuable to customers because it's already been ridded of evil spirits. Do you see how that would work? How valuable they would think that would be? And so when the Corinthians are saying to Paul in the letter, we all possess knowledge about this particular subject, he's saying to them, or they are saying to him, we know this is all nonsense. We all know this is just pagan nonsense. There are no evil spirits in the meat. There are no gods behind these statues. It's all just a scam. And indeed, if you and I went to like India today, where they have very superstitious things about animals and how they make their sacrifices, you and I would feel the same way. We would think this is all just a hoax. It's all nothing. Okay? The problem is, even though there are some in the Corinthian church who claim to have knowledge about this, not everyone in the church has that same knowledge. And there are two ways that Christians who were not secure in their knowledge might be affected by these others. Number one, some Christians, especially those who have just been converted from a pagan lifestyle, may still believe in some of these superstitions that once gripped them. And for them to participate in any way in something that has any attachment to that old pagan lifestyle, that breaks their conscience, and they might actually believe that the spirits are still involved with that. And if they still exist, they think Christians shouldn't be messing with any of that, so better just to stay away from it altogether. Could you see how a young Christian might think in that sort of way? I think most of us can be pretty sympathetic about that. Old habits, old ways of thinking, they don't immediately die in us when we convert. It takes a while to get new habits, new knowledge ingrained into your mind. Here's the second way it might have affected them. Even if they had come to believe that there are no gods and that the evil spirits are not able to inhabit things like meat and that sort of thing, it may be true that just participating in it, in anything that has anything to do with it, brings up uncomfortable memories for them, uncomfortable associations, and it disturbs their peace. And for them, they don't want to be around that, nor do they want to feel the social pressure of another Christian eating it around them, making them, well, maybe not making is the right word, but kind of pressuring them to eat something that really disturbs their conscience. And so, Paul's going to quote them. Yeah, he recognizes, okay, you've got knowledge, but what's the remedy? How do Christians with different views handle this? And Paul is going to lay the responsibility at the feet of those who have the stronger and firmer conscience. And he's going to say to them, your conscience or your knowledge must be intermingled with love. It's great that you can know something that your brothers and sisters in Christ are not able to yet understand at the moment, but you can actually harm your brother and sister with your knowledge. And so your knowledge has to be balanced with love and care for them. And Paul says in verse 3, it's the one who loves that's really known by God. You know, you can know right doctrine and still have a bad heart. But what he wants to know is the one who's really known to God is the one who loves his fellow brother and sister. And so there are kind of two errors to avoid in this regard. A person doesn't want to have knowledge without love. You also don't want to have love without knowledge. That's probably the more dangerous temptation in our particular day. Lots of people who say we're all for love, but they don't want to combine it with truth. Paul doesn't expound upon that here, but both of those things would be true. Dallas Willard, who I used to read a lot, used to have this great saying. He would say, being right is one of the hardest things for human beings to bear. And that's true, isn't it? Knowledge tends to make us arrogant. And if you doubt that, and I doubt you do, just take a little venture on social media, as some of us do, and tell me whether or not you think knowledge makes people arrogant. I can assure you that it does. That's not a new problem. It's an old human problem. We've got a new manifestation of it these days, a new outlet for it. Being right is one of the hardest things to bear. Before we move on to the content of their knowledge, any questions or thoughts about some of that opening information? I hear a nursery rhyme. Gonna lull us to sleep here. Any questions or thoughts about that?
I had
Yeah.
strange. Do you suppose the sacrificed meat costs more or less?
I bet it costs more. I bet, yeah.
Because it could be that you might say, I like to buy that meat because it's cheaper.
Right.
Or maybe, hey, it's really good over at this place.
Right, yeah. I mean, if they can promise that this has been ridded of spirits already, I would think that would be of greater value.
Maybe someone says, I really like that God over there because, man, that tastes much better than this.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to give me some Dionysius. I don't want Apollo, yeah. That's right. That's right. Yeah.
You had said, Curtis,
Yeah.
that we don't have much to worry about with this kind of thing. But
Yeah.
If you've been following Julie Broyles over in Cambodia at the Best Center, those people that are converted to Christianity there regularly run into maybe not this exact same thing, but
Yes.
they run into the culture that's there
Yeah.
of their families and so on, and they have to make decisions as to whether they're going to participate in certain festivals or go to the temple or do that kind of thing, or are they going to not do those kinds of things. So it's not that this doesn't have any effect at all in the modern world. There are places where this is an issue.
Yeah, that's right. I remember when I was at Sunset, Ed Warden would talk about his trips over to Indonesia to do preaching over there. And he always would go and preach on Ephesians and Colossians, which has to do with the principalities and the powers and all that kind of stuff, because they were very intimidated by evil spirits over there and thought that you had to do practices called naming the names, where you had to name the demons in order to try to cast them away from you. There's all sorts of things that, so there are certainly some places in the world where this sort of thing would be, just as red hot on their cultural radar. It just doesn't happen to be. We went to what was that place called last night, Dad? What was the Super East, or it was a Chinese restaurant over there on right behind the East Mall by the Sweet Spot. You know what that is? Yeah, I had a lot of meat, and I didn't worry one bit about it. I did not lose any sleep.
Oh, Interchange?
It's
No.
it's kind of unfortunate, but it is true that we talk about, well, over there,
Yeah.
these things are happening,
Yeah.
but this stuff is growing in America.
It actually is. Yeah.
Use of Ouija boards,
Yeah.
stuff like that is,
Mhm.
in the younger generation,
Yep.
unfortunately, is becoming quite popular.
Yeah, I've heard stuff talking about how Wicca is growing and all that kind of stuff. So even though it's far from dominant, it may be an issue one time
Especially the
again.
younger generation.
Yeah, I think that's right. So that's good.
Curtis,
Yeah.
So you said they named the spirits?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
If you read the Harry Potter series, I haven't read all of them, I've read some of them.
Mhm.
My family read them. They went out of their way to not name who was evil.
That's interesting.
They didn't want to know who was evil.
Yeah.
They wanted to know
Is that right?
somebody was
Oh man.
Thou shalt not be named.
Yeah. Well, there's this phrase, about Jesus being the name that is above all names, and there's some thought that that's why that phrase developed, is because Paul was trying to counter the naming of the names in places like Ephesus and Colossae, and I don't know if that's right, but if it is, it would make a good deal of sense. Okay. All right, we're probably not going to get through all three of our headings, but let's press forward just a little bit. Starting in verse 4, we move into our second heading. So we've seen the general principle, but now he's going to quote them two more times. Look at verse 4. So then, about eating food sacrificed to idols, we know that, and he's going to quote here. This would be quotes in my Bible. An idol is nothing at all in the world. That's one quote. And then the second quote, there is no God but one. Okay, so an idol is nothing at all in the world, and there is no God but one. So those are both in quotes. Yeah, I think Paul is quoting the previous letter that's what they're claiming is their knowledge. We know an idol really is nothing, and that's true, isn't it? Let me show you a couple of passages where that bears out. Let me just one maybe, since we're running out of time. Look over. I didn't have room to print this on the back of your handout, but look at Psalm 115, if you would, in your own Bibles. Psalm 115. Look at verse 2, starting there. Here's a question by the psalmist. Why do the nations say to us, he's implying, where is their God? Why do all the nations castigate our God, Yahweh, Jehovah? Why do they, and so he's going to answer, verse 3. Our God is in heaven, and he does whatever he pleases. But notice what he goes on to say. But their idols, in contrast to our God, their idols are silver and gold made by human hands. They have mouths but cannot speak, eyes but cannot see. They have ears but cannot hear, noses but cannot smell. They have hands but cannot feel, feet but cannot walk, nor can they utter a sound with their throats. Those who make them will be like them, and so will all who trust in them. So, here the nations are saying to Israel, where is your God? And the psalmist responds and says, our God is in heaven and he does whatever he wants. He does whatever pleases him. But then he says, how about your gods? Your idols. They're made out of silver and gold. They're made by human hands. They have mouths but can't speak, ears but can't hear, hands but can't feel, feet but can't walk. There's the true nature of an idol and how silly it is that you worship that. This is what the Corinthians know. The idol really is nothing. And they're claiming that knowledge. But Paul's going to say, well, perhaps not everybody among you knows that. And so how are you going to work that out? And we'll catch up a little bit more on that next week. We didn't get through nearly everything, only about half of our material here this morning. So we'll fill that in and move into chapter 9 beginning next week. Any last questions or comments? All right. Appreciate your time this morning, and you all have a blessed afternoon. Go home and watch the Chiefs.